PowerPoint up, yay.
Woo. All right. Okay. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. If anybody wants to try to get my attention and ask questions while I'm going, please feel free to. And I will also plan to be around for questions after. I know.
Allison, let's go ahead and have folks put that in the chat,
Okay.
and then we'll feed those questions to you.
That sounds great.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great.
Okay. All right. So I'm talking about anxiety and executive functioning today, and I always like to start with talking about the brain, because it really helps me to visualize where things are happening and what's happening when I'm talking about things that happen in the brain. So in a general orientation to the brain, can people see my mouse pointing? We have the cerebrum, cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, the hippocampus, and then the two places we're going to spend our time today are the amygdala here and the prefrontal cortex. All right, so when I talk about anxiety, I talk about the amygdala. That's that little tiny yellow thing in the previous slide. And the name amygdala comes from maybe the Latin for almond, because the amygdala is in your brain. It's about the size and the shape of an almond. Not very big, but very powerful. It's right here in the brain. All right, and the one of the main roles that it serves in the brain is acting as a smoke detector and kind of fire alarm, right? We want the amygdala to work just like we want our smoke detectors and fire alarms to work. We want it to tell us when there's the danger. It's responsible for helping us interpret signals that tell us when we need to be anxious or worried or scared and do something about it. So that's what's happening there in the brain with the amygdala. I'll return to that in a little bit here. So when I'm talking about anxiety, there are three main components we talk about: feelings and somatic features. So feeling worried, and then physical symptoms like stomach aches and headaches. There are behavioral features, so avoiding things that make us feel that way. And then cognitive features: worry, uncertainty, thinking about potential outcomes, getting preoccupied. That preoccupation and those cognitive features are what can make anxiety masquerade as ADHD. So sometimes we have kids who have anxiety and we think they have ADHD because their amygdalas are getting a little overactive and supporting that preoccupation. I'll get back to that in a little bit here too. Anxiety is a really useful emotion and series and collection of responses for us. It's normal and it's also critical. We wouldn't have evolved to the humans we are today if we didn't have anxiety as part of our menu of reactions. It's a normal reaction to stress, uncertainty, and difficult situations. And some anxiety can improve our performance, help us hone our attention, focus, and think about what's coming up next. But at some point, too much anxiety can start to interfere, and it becomes problematic when it's more persistent, more debilitating, and more unreasonable than normal, when it starts to interfere with life. There's several different types of anxiety disorders that we diagnose clinically. The most common one is generalized anxiety disorder, but some people may be familiar with separation anxiety disorder. See a lot of that too. And the pandemic sure changed and increased almost all of these. Social anxiety disorder and social phobia, panic disorder, selective mutism, specific phobias like spiders, storms, needles, and agoraphobia. And somebody who has anxiety is not limited to just one type of anxiety. You can have multiple types of anxiety. It's really common, and it's much more common now, we think, than it was before the pandemic started. Anxiety is the most common emotional problem in children. Before the pandemic started, more than 9% of 3 to 17-year-olds had been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And we know that for every kid who's actually been diagnosed with a disorder, there are definitely more kids that have anxiety, have struggled with anxiety, and maybe even to a clinical or interfering level, but don't have a diagnosis. So anxiety often occurs with other problems. Again, before the pandemic, more than 1 in 3 kids who had anxiety also had behavior problems. Almost 40% of those kids, and about 1 in 3 also had depression. Conversely, children who have identified behavior problems, more than 1 in 3 of those kids also had anxiety when we stopped to take a look, and about 1 in 5 also had depression. Again, anxiety is good at masquerading as other things. So anxiety disorders are partly heritable. That doesn't mean that every person who has an anxiety disorder has a genetic component, but they are genetically linked. You can have early stressful life events that also sensitize the biological pathways, especially in the brain, to increase the probability of anxiety happening. That can happen in kids who experience trauma. There are also factors like the match between a caregiver and a child, a caregiver style and a child temperament, and then thinking patterns and habits. Cognitive types of features also contribute to anxiety. And then there are social factors: stress, pandemics, environment like school, the news, all kinds of things can sort of plant seeds of anxiety. So back to that smoke detector. We want our smoke detector to tell us really, really loudly and really, really urgently when there's a fire. But we also want that smoke detector to be calibrated appropriately so that it's not telling us there's a fire when somebody's making toast and maybe burning it a little bit. In anxiety disorders, that calibration can be off, and that amygdala, little almond alarm in our brains, can tell us that there's a fire or that there's a big problem or a threat when there isn't. Recalibrating that sensor and getting better at getting it to work better is part of what we do in treating anxiety. The vicious cycle of anxiety is one that, unless we stop, it results in an increase in anxiety. So when somebody experiences anxiety, they start to engage in behavior like increased scanning for danger, more physical symptoms like getting tight in all the muscles, maybe having more stomach aches, start to focus more and more on myself and if I'm in danger, and stop thinking about the broader social context. And then the most common behavior that happens next is to escape or avoid the thing that's making me anxious. In the short term, that escaping or avoiding lets me relax again and feel some relief. But by avoiding that thing that I was afraid of, in the long term, my anxiety is going to get worse. I'm going to have more worry, less confidence that I can deal with that thing that I was worried about. And then my anxiety gets bigger, and I start to scan more, and I start to avoid more, and then I relax. And then while I'm relaxing, the anxiety grows. We often talk about anxious thoughts and anxiety as being a worry bully, because it can kind of bully somebody's brain into getting more and more worried over time. Talk a little bit about what we do to stop that cycle in a little bit. So how do I know if anxiety is a problem for my child? If my child is worrying a lot, if they're having a lot of physical symptoms, complaining of headaches or stomach aches, they're avoiding things that they would otherwise enjoy. They might have difficulty concentrating, have trouble sleeping. They might be engaging in disruptive behavior, or clinging a lot, or being extra hard on themselves. Those are all signs that anxiety might be part of the mix. I'm working with a teenage boy right now who's 17, who really, really wants to go on a program to do some tech exploration. But he has really significant separation anxiety that's kind of been sneaky for a while because he hasn't had to test it very much. And he's avoiding that thing that he really, really wants to do and choosing something that's close to home so he doesn't have to separate. So that's interfering with his life, and we need to work on it. It's time to do something with when the anxiety becomes unrealistic, out of proportion, unwanted, and uncontrollable, doesn't go away, and especially causes avoidance. Brooks Powers Group has been doing a lot of work over the last several years in school refusal. That's an anxiety-related issue that we are seeing more and more of. To reverse that vicious cycle of anxiety, we want to confront those situations that we're afraid of without having any safety behaviors, without kind of doing a lot of reassuring. That's going to increase anxiety right away, but those symptoms go away on their own if we stay in it long enough. When we use coping skills, we can get symptoms even lower, and then we can realize, oh, I have more agency here. I can be more in control of what's happening in my body and my brain. But it has to start with exposure, with facing that fear. Some strategies to address anxiety are also related to that exposure, bringing it out into the open, talking about feelings and experiences, having adults talk about times that they're afraid, times that they've been afraid, make it normal. Anxiety is absolutely normal and absolutely not pathological and not problematic most of the time. Everyone experiences it at some point, even if not everybody's anxiety gets to that interfering level. We can also do a lot of modeling of coping skills. So saying out loud times that we are feeling anxious. Oh, I'm about to give a presentation. What if I can't get it right? What if people laugh at me? Whew, okay, if I get it wrong, this is a nice group of people. They'll help me out. They'll be kind. I can deal with this. I can move forward. Those strategies work in all settings. I had a kindergarten teacher that was starting to teach his students how to find mistakes on words written on a whiteboard. And not only did he model how to find those mistakes, but he also modeled that self-talk for anxiety when he was teaching that skill to students. That was in a general education class, and that just introduced that idea that those anxious feelings and thoughts are normal. This really cool, awesome kindergarten teacher is having them, and he's taking a deep breath and moving forward. So that normalization and that modeling really makes a difference. Adults can do a lot of things to make anxiety, and we can do a lot of things to make it worse in our children. And most often, the ways that we make it worse are by trying to make it better. So there are, now maybe I've made you a little bit anxious about making your kids' anxiety worse. Sorry, I'll try to clarify a little bit more. One of the things that's really important to think about doing for kids who are experiencing anxiety is not to try to talk them out of it. So certainly if they think they're about to get eaten by the small 7-pound dog that just walked by them, we want to help make sure that we're giving them clear and accurate information. But we don't want to do reassurance that where we say things like, you'll be fine, or that's silly, that would never happen, because in a child's mind that can land as, oh no, they don't get it, now I'm really on my own, I guess I'm really in trouble and nobody understands, right? We don't want to isolate somebody in their anxiety by trying to minimize it, even if it is minimal, or even if the perceived threat is truly minimal. Also, telling children to just stop thinking about it. A child might think something is really wrong with me. I'm going to have to hide not only my anxiety, but also the things that I'm afraid of. I really have to do this on my own. So instead, things that we can do are ask about it and validate. We want to ask things like, how are you feeling about this? Not, oh, this is really anxiety producing. Are you really anxious here? Because we don't want to plant those seeds necessarily. But validating is one of the most powerful tools that we can use as adults and as parents. It doesn't mean that we agree that our child or our children are right to be anxious about the thing that they're anxious about, but it tells them that we hear that they are anxious about it. And that's a really powerful thing for anybody to hear. When somebody says, wow, you are really anxious, you're really worried about this. I see that. That can cause an immediate response in the brain and the body of the child that helps calm them down, right? So just saying things like, you feel really worried, when a child tells us that they feel worried, is really powerful. And then normalize. Everyone experiences anxiety. Sometimes people get worried about their worry. We can do things about this, right? We can explain why it happens and why they feel what they're feeling. A lot of kids have come into my office and I've given them an almond to show them what's going on in their brain. And just having those kinds of tangible visuals sometimes really makes things feel achievable and manageable to kids. Sometimes our brains get confused about danger. We're going to work on you learning how you can be the boss of your brain. Naming our fears really works. Naming our emotions really works. If you're really mad and you say, wow, I am really mad, your anger will actually go down a few notches. We have good brain science that tells us that naming it really does tame it as far as feelings go. Breathing is also something that sends messages to our smoke detector in our brain. Things are okay. You don't need to protect me right now, or we're okay. And checking our own anxiety. Sometimes when we're trying really hard to hide our own fears and worries from kids, kids are completely aware of our experience with anxiety and worry. Sometimes they're recognizing the same behaviors or symptoms in us that they recognize in themselves. So we want to be honest about what we're experiencing and what we're doing to deal with it, right? Feeling isolated and alone in anxiety is a really scary thing for a child or a teenager to experience. So other things we can do as adults to help turn it around are supporting exposures. Don't let kids out of doing the things that they're afraid to do. Don't rescue them from it. So that can be really, really hard to do, to watch your child have tremendous amounts of anxiety about walking into school, for example. And as long as you know that school is a safe place to be, sending them into school is really, really important, right? Of course, we don't want to send our kids into places where we are not sure that they're going to be safe. But when we know it's safe, we really have to stand strong in supporting doing those things that are scary. Because if we rescue them, then we're saying, you're right, there really is something there to be worried about. There really is a danger there. And we don't want to inadvertently reinforce anxiety by trying to let our kids get out of things that are scary for them. We also have had people who've gotten really, really creative about addressing fears and worries. Like, this kid was worried about germs, and so the principal at school got involved and created a special pathway for them to walk in that nobody else could walk in. And he made a germ control spray, and it was really effective. And this kid had a great pathway to school. And wow, did that kid believe that, boy, things were dangerous and germy, because if the principal is getting in on needing to spray for germs, it must be really, really bad. Those efforts to try to help can inadvertently backfire. We want to reflect on success. That was scary, but you did it anyway. Are you safe? Great. Wow, you are brave. And then it can be surprisingly effective to use words like safe and I see you in settling children's anxiety. So just saying to somebody, you are safe, can take anxiety down a few notches. It's pretty powerful stuff. One of the most important jobs that we have is protect our children and our adolescents from danger and harm and to prepare them for it. It can get really confusing when we have kids who are really panicked and really scared about things to confuse protecting them from fear instead of protecting them from danger. It's hard to watch our children experience fear and experience anxiety. But if we protect them from those feelings, then we rob them of the opportunity to learn to cope with it. So we also have to support ourselves in doing those hard things as much as possible, and each other. Since this is a special education parent-teacher group, I want to make sure to talk a little bit about what we sometimes put in IEPs for kids who experience significant anxiety. So making sure that there's consistency in language and strategies that are used across all settings. Having staff at school that are sensitive to anxiety and sensitive to avoidance patterns and don't do those accidental accommodations that make anxiety worse instead of better. Sometimes we have counseling that happens at school to support kids with anxiety. Sometimes we have behavior intervention plans that are anxiety informed, right? For those 40% of kids who have anxiety and also have significant behavior issues that may be related to that anxiety. Specially designed instruction for use of self-regulation strategies, especially when anxiety occurs in academic settings, like kids who get really, really anxious about math, for example, or really, really anxious about presenting in front of other people. Teaching strategies to use to get calmed down in those settings. It's not a math goal, it's a social emotional goal, but you can specify that that goal be addressed in the setting where the anxiety really, really affects them. Accommodations and modifications to support engagement and access to supports. Communication with home and communication with clinical providers is really critical. I love talking to IEP teams to make sure that any work I'm doing on anxiety with a kid in my clinical practice, that I'm sharing ideas and information and observations with people who see that child at school. And then sometimes this also means trauma-informed training for school staff, which I think is never a bad idea for anybody to have. Trauma-informed training is really powerful. So that's our sort of quick dive into anxiety. And now I'm shifting to the other part of the brain that I talked about earlier.
Allison, can we ask a couple quick questions?
Yeah.
So one question that we had is, can you say just a little bit more about the match between caregiver and child temperament?
Yes. Yeah. So sometimes we have kids that are really, really sensitive to tone or not very good at reading facial expressions in caregivers. And if we have a caregiver who has really flat affect or who might have a really unpredictable energy level or that kind of thing, that match to the child's temperament, if the child is somebody who needs a lot of calm consistency, that can sort of lead to patterns of anxiety as well.
Okay. And then one other, I got a clarifying question. Let's see. I think the question now is, I think it has to do a little bit around anxiety, right? And having a safety net around that. So the question was, when you're talking about facing anxiety without a safety net, how do you mitigate anxiety without support or self-soothing strategies and not have it become trauma?
Oh, that's a great question, right? You say, you're afraid of the water, I'm going to push you into the deep end. that's not the kind of exposure that we want to do. So often when we're talking about facing our fears or facing those difficult situations, we want to plan for it and do it in a way that doesn't traumatize. That's really an important question. Sometimes it can be hard to tell the difference between OCD kinds of fears and worries, obsessive fears that occur with OCD, and worries that occur with anxiety disorders. And one of the directions that that the research is taking us in treating OCD is exposing a child to something that they're really worried about without pairing it with calming strategies. And depending on the thing that they're really worried about, one of the most important lessons they can learn is I can touch this thing that I don't want to touch that I think is germy, and it's going to feel really scary at first, and I'm not going to do deep breathing or other calming strategies. I'm just going to keep touching it, and I'm going to realize within seconds and under a minute that my anxiety is going down without needing to do any other kinds of things. But we're not going to put somebody into a porta potty that's full of terrible germs as the first step of that exposure plan. So so we want to be cautious and careful about that, but not reinforce anxiety accidentally.
Okay. And then one more question, and then we'll kind of move on. But so Dr. Green, actually, Dr. Ross Green came and talked in Seattle last night, which was great.
Awesome.
And one of the things that he talked about was school avoidance, that possibly the kiddo might not have the skills. So to be able to, like, maybe a lack of skills is what is causing a behavior or anxiety.
Yeah.
How do you know when a student might be struggling with anxiety versus the lack of skills that need to be addressed?
Well, and when lack of skills also creates anxiety is a really important sort of piece of that question too. So I'm actually going to talk a lot in this next section about understanding, sort of trying to understand the difference of when it's a competence issue, when it's something that somebody can't do versus something that they won't do, right? And regulating anxiety and building the skill of knowing that you can sort of beat the bully in your brain, it's a skill to develop as well. It's not just a naturally occurring ability that we all have. So but it's absolutely really important to understand the difference there. School refusal is a very complicated issue. By the time somebody's sort of got to the point where they're refusing school, it is a multi-layer, multi-level issue that requires multiple people, multiple avenues of communication to address. And very often, one of the first things that we say is when we have somebody who is exhibiting school refusal behaviors, we got to make sure that we haven't missed a learning disability, that we haven't missed ADHD, that we haven't missed a bully who really is making school feel like an unsafe place to be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and stop for now, and then go ahead and I'm sure we'll get more questions come in after. Thank you.
I'm going to talk here about the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive department. So executive is a term that generally means sort of the ones in charge, the ones guiding the path forward, right? When we think about companies, we think about the CEO or the central executive officer, the executive administrative assistant, those kinds of things, right? The prefrontal cortex in the brain is like the brain's executive department, the front office people. So when we talk about executive functionings, we're talking about things like identifying a goal, thinking about short and long-term goals, maintaining persistence and trying to reach goals, coming up with strategies to tackle challenges, monitoring what we're doing to see if it's efficient, to see if it's effective and working, keeping everybody in the company motivated and ready to work, organizing time and materials, keeping emotions under control, inhibiting impulses, meaning thinking first instead of acting first and then thinking, oops, I shouldn't have done that. And being flexible, or flexible thinking, flexible problem solving, and including social problem solving. A lot of these things are things that we sometimes think of as personality features or character features, but they're all brain related skills that are housed up here in that prefrontal cortex. The rest of the brain, the rest of the company, things like intelligence, motor skills, language skills, sensory processing, memory, academic skills, right? Those are all skills that we're developing before we're adding in the executive to start guiding the path forward. Before kids get to maybe 2nd or 3rd grade, who's the executive in charge of that kid's company? It's the parents, right? Really, it's people at home who are saying, here's our goal, here's the time management, here's your jacket, here's your lunch, right? And then the executive starts warming up and starts getting ready to take over some of those skills. Without a good CEO to set strategies and goals and a good executive secretary to organize and monitor, the smartest, strongest, best skilled company will be unlikely to succeed. It's really critical to have that executive in there. It's also like the conductor of an orchestra, somebody who's making sure that everybody's working together, making sure everybody's starting at the same time, knows what's supposed to happen. Development of executive functions is not a smooth trajectory. Executive functions are kind of the latest or the last area of skill to start developing in the brain. In preschool, executive functioning really does one thing, and that's pretty much emotional control. It doesn't always do it well in preschoolers. There's a lot of growth happening at that time. But in 3rd and 4th grade, we start saying to kids, navigate more complicated social situations by yourself. Start writing book reports. Start planning science fair projects, right? We're really starting to up the ante on what the executive needs to do. In early adolescence, there's kind of another burst of growth in the executive functions. And then it's continued development through middle adulthood, through even the late 20s and into the 30s. One of the things that we know is that most people who have some kind of neurodevelopmental difference, like autism or learning disability or ADHD, also have executive function challenges. Right? If you have ADHD, you definitely have some executive function challenges. If you have executive function challenges, you don't necessarily have ADHD, but there's a lot of overlap. So how do you know if your child has executive function problems? Have you or other people described your child in this way? They're just not trying. They could do it if they tried. She's smart enough, so she must not care. How can someone so smart be so messy or so lazy or so disorganized? He is smart, but he has no common sense. I find him baffling. He doesn't make sense to me. She's doing it on purpose to send me to an early grave. If you or someone you love has said this about your child, there's a chance that executive functioning is the culprit. It can be really confusing to see somebody be really capable in a lot of ways and then not be able to hold it together. And sometimes that's because of the executive function department. Most of that is housed in the prefrontal cortex, but the executive function system is the last to develop because it is creating connections across the entire brain. That conductor has to have connections to where the entire rest of the company is. It's the communication system between all the parts. Executive function problems can be acquired by head injury, by exposure to alcohol in the prenatal period, by degenerative conditions, by a stroke, right? But they're present at birth as they're typically affected in children who have neurodevelopmental disorders. So other clues that somebody might have executive function challenges is So a child who doesn't have their materials, doesn't have things organized, the backpack's a disaster, the bedroom's a disaster. They have trouble getting things done. They can only follow one step at a time, not a 2 or 3 step direction like their peers. Transitions are hard. That's where flexibility is required. They have a hard time staying on task or managing their time, initiating work, prioritizing. Emotional and behavioral control is an executive function, and get overwhelmed by tasks that seem easy. So what do we do with kids who have brains where the executive function system is not working very well? This cartoon, for those of you who are on small screens, is a teenager standing and facing parents, and the parent is saying, "Young man, go to your room and stay there until your cerebral cortex matures." Not going to be the most effective way to deal with it. So what do we do in intervention? Focus is most effective when it's on changing behavior rather than changing the person, right? We're using accommodations, and accommodations are things adults can do to support somebody else. We teach and model, and I'm going to talk to you about opportunities for that you may not realize are opportunities. And remember that brain differences can't be changed through motivation. If that prefrontal cortex is not sufficiently developed to help somebody navigate a multi-step task, dangling a candy bar or $100 bill in front of them isn't going to change that brain readiness, right? So when motivation, threats, rewards don't work, the problem might be that the brain's not ready yet. That might be a sign that it's an executive function problem. So what do? We understand a person's individual profile. We do neuropsych evaluations sometimes. And then we try to see challenges as skills deficits, not character deficits. That kid who's having a hard time transitioning isn't just a unpleasant person. There's somebody whose executive function system isn't helping them with flexibility, right? And we adjust our expectations appropriately for what we know about that individual, provide accommodations, and then teach skills and strategies. Compliance is something I was talking about before, competency. At the heart of all compliance issues is a competency issue. And this is definitely something that the guy we were just talking about, my brain just glitched, talks about as well. We have to move from seeing behavior as non-compliance to seeing it as non-competence, meaning this isn't an issue with not wanting to do something or refusing to do something, but not being able to do something. That process of shifting how we look at behavior is known as reframing. Diane Malbin is a person who has been a pioneer in the area of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, which is a category of disorders that really, really get impacted by or experience impacts in the prefrontal cortex and the executive functions. She says it's not about trying harder, it's about learning how to do things differently. So we reframe from seeing behavior as somebody who can't, or somebody who won't do something, to somebody who can't do something. And it gives us all kinds of options when we interpret children's behavior in that way. An example of this is, rather than interpreting a child who isn't getting done with homework, for example, as lazy, meaning they won't, thinking about them as they can't. They're trying really hard, but they don't know where to start. Children who lie often are filling in or trying to make sense of, or telling us, I had the right intentions, but my brain got hijacked. I didn't inhibit my impulse. Somebody who doesn't try, maybe instead let's think about them as somebody who doesn't know how to start. So trying, you can't try if you don't know where to start. Somebody who is described as mean, maybe we can reframe that behavior as they're defensive, they're in fight or flight mode, right? There's anxiety poking its head in again. They don't care, they shut down. So maybe they don't feel safe showing feelings. Instead of resistant, they're afraid to try. They don't understand what to do. Trying to get attention, need support? They're a thief, or do they don't not understand ownership? Not trying, right? They know what to do, they're just not trying. In need of reteaching, wires aren't connecting today. So all ways to reframe behavior from can't to won't. When we think about behavior as interpret it in that won't category, our options are to say, you don't get your reward, right? You were lazy, you didn't try, so you don't get to go to the ice cream shop. You're being mean, therefore you can't have a friend over. If we interpret it as can't, then we say, I will show you where to start. Try that out and then call me back and I'll show you the next thing to do, right? It gives us a lot of options of what we can do as the adults if we shift our thinking. So another way to tell if you're encountering executive function challenges is comes from Walter Barbie, who wrote a guide for daily living. And he says, if you've told a child 1,000 times and he still doesn't understand, then it's not the child who's the slow learner. Right? At the number of times I've said, how many times do I have to tell you, to my own children is somewhat embarrassing, but I like that to be kind of the alert for, oh, I need to change what I'm doing. I need to stop asking you to change and stop asking you to understand. So examples of accommodations, those things adults can do to support kids with executive functioning, is giving extra processing time, using visual supports, doing showing, not just telling what to do, giving shortened assignments, preferential seating. These are all accommodations that might be on a 504 planner or an IEP. Color coding to help support organization, graphic organizers to help support organization, having a checklist attached to a backpack to support tracking of materials and keeping track of belongings. Having planners and calendars is a really big one, and getting support with planners and calendars. Lots of kids get beautiful planners and they never get used because if it's not, there's not teaching that goes along with it, it might never take off. Everything can be in its place, and if you have a label calendar, nobody else does it, right? I was guilty of doing the calendar when my kids went to bed. So my kids didn't really see that I was doing a calendar and didn't really see that I was keeping a checklist. Modeling is a really effective form of teaching. So it's really important for kids to see when we're using our executive function skills every day. Show and tell, narrate as you do things throughout the day. Don't wait until the kids are in bed to pull out the calendar or to balance your finances, right? As you're driving, you might have to make 2 stops on the way to pick up the dog. The post office closes first, but it's farther away. Okay, gotta leave ourselves enough time for this, or I'm gonna have to call to tell your brother that we're gonna be a little bit late, right? I have a lot of things on my schedule today. I need to look at my calendar. School picture day is soon. Let's look at our budget to see what we need to do so we can get that package that you want, right? I'm gonna make dinner. The first thing that I'm gonna do is check to see if we have all the ingredients. There was this one time I went to make chocolate chip cookies and I had everything in, and then found out that I didn't have chocolate chips. That was a real bummer. I'm gonna check that I have all the ingredients first. Those are all places where we're using our executive functioning, and if we say it out loud, we're teaching our kids to do those things too. Games like red light, green light teach inhibition and teach executive functioning. Games like Simon Says also help develop those early foundational skills of executive functioning, right? When we have kids who have complicated brains, right, parts of their brains that are really good at things and other parts that aren't working so well, and they're trying to make sense of it, it's really important for us as adults to identify what the strengths are so we can take advantage of those strengths. We use positive behavior interventions and supports at school, It's the most effective intervention that we can use at home, at school, in the workplace, is catching people doing the things that we want them to do and saying something about it. I see you did that thing that I wanted you to do. That's great. If we're primed to recognize people's strengths, it makes it way easier to find those places to give those positive comments, right? It also means that our kids have less secondary anxiety that comes up when they're having trouble navigating the world and feeling overwhelmed. So when you've got a kiddo who's having some trouble with a behavior or with a task, ask yourself, is this a can't or is this a won't situation? I'm really tempted to think it's a won't. But if it's a can't, what's the can't? Is it not knowing where to start? Is it being afraid I can't do it? Ask, what's the skill deficit? What can I change in what I do? What accommodation can I provide? And then we can do all kinds of things like prevention, keeping things consistent, having schedules that are posted in our homes and in our classrooms, making sure that directions are clear, follow up for success and follow up for when things don't work so that we can change the plan. So the interplay of anxiety and executive function is also really important. If we think back to those executive functions, goal identification, persistence, strategy development, emotional control, bolstering motivation, organizing materials, being flexible in your thinking, the alarm is going off. All of a sudden it's really loud and there's red lights flashing. Which of those executive functions do you want to use? None of them, right? They're not helpful in an emergency situation. That prefrontal cortex takes a lot of energy, a lot of blood flow, a lot of brain energy. So if our smoke alarm in our brain goes off, the firewall goes down, the blast doors close. We don't need you, executive function. We don't need long-term planning. We need to get the heck out of here. The house is on fire, right? But if the house isn't on fire and somebody just needs to do some planning for a book report, they're not going to be able to access their prefrontal cortex with those blast doors closed. So kids who have trouble regulating anxiety often have a lot more trouble accessing their executive functions when their brains are on alert and when the smoke detector is going off. So regulating anxiety supports executive functioning. Similarly, poor executive functioning can result in increased anxiety, feeling overwhelmed by tasks. A lot of our kids who have executive function problems, we say to them, clean up your toys, and they see something that seems absolutely unattainable. And if we say, pick up all of the Legos first and then come back to me, that can help decrease anxiety by making it more manageable. Those are often the kids who are hearing negative messages about their effort. How many times do I have to tell you? How can you be so smart and so so bad at turning in your homework, right? Kids feel no matter how hard I try, I still fail, because they don't need to try harder, they need to try differently. So those experiences can trigger anxiety, secondary anxiety. So supporting children and teens with anxiety-informed strategies can help them with anxiety and with executive function. Supporting children and teens with executive function accommodations and skills development can help them with executive functions and with anxiety, right? Some of my favorite resources to get more information and to get recommendations are in these sites. Childmind has lots of great stuff. Anxiety Canada is also a really excellent resource. Space treatment is a more recent evidence-based treatment for childhood anxiety, where the child doesn't ever have to talk to the therapist, only the parents do. It's incredibly effective because it teaches parents how to recognize anxiety and accommodations and help support exposures and to stop making anxiety worse by trying to help it. Don Huebner's books, like What to Do When You Worry Too Much, are really excellent. They're very child-friendly and early teen-friendly books for anxiety, OCD. She has one called What to Do When You Dread Your Bed, those kinds of things. The website Understood is a great one and has a lot of resources and recommendations for executive function, and also for IEP supports for kids who have executive function challenges. There are many books in the Smart But Scattered series by Peg Dawson and Richard Guari. There's also a lot more books now available now, like the Executive Skills Workbook for Teens, those kinds of things. Child Mind also has a good section on executive function. And then there are too many resources to count or to point you to favorite ones for graphic organizers and planning apps, Canvas, those kinds of things. Lots of good stuff out there. So that's it. That was my race through the basics of executive functioning and anxiety. And I want to make sure we get to talk about questions if people have questions.
Oh, thank you so much.
Sure.
One of the questions was, will the links from the presentation be available later? And I just wanted to address that by saying we will go through and pull all those links that you shared at the end. We'll just include them with our recording information. So I just wanted to let folks know about that.
I'd be happy to send you the PDF or the presentation as PDFs that can be
Great,
shared.
that'll be awesome. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you, anyway,
problem.
yes.
Yeah.
I didn't want to ask for too much, but yes, that would be amazing. So I guess if anyone has any questions at this point, like if you want to raise your hand, we'd be happy to take them verbally. I think sometimes it's hard to write out those questions at 8:25 at night. So,
Yes. All right, Jessica.
Hi, yeah, I was trying to write out a question and I was struggling with how to frame it exactly, but I was thinking back on this study I read on autistic adults.
Uh-huh.
And the participants had self-reported that they preferred adult reminders, like adult support, over like things like calendars and alarms and color coding things and labeling things, and to help them with their struggles with executive function. And I was just wondering, and when I read that, it made me feel nervous for my son, because I thought, I know that my reminders do help him, but will he ever be able to be more independent?
Yeah.
And so I just wondered, is there a way to set your kid up so that someday that they won't be as reliant on those reminders and things and on adult support? Or is that just a core of just being autistic?
Right. Are you going to forever be attached to your child's side until you find them a great roommate or partner who has really good executive functioning skills? It's a great question. And, I love thinking about self-advocacy in here as a skill to teach that's really connected to this, so that as somebody who does need help with executive function grows, they have the skills to ask for the kind of help that they most want. But we don't set people up for success by only supporting the delivery of skills in the modality that they want it, right? We can't always guarantee that somebody's going to be around. So it's really good to work on strategies that do help with that growth of independence. We also have to be really patient in that process for kids with any type of neurodiversity, because executive functions tend to take longer to come online. Often it's mid-20s instead of 18, 19 that we see this burst of, well, lots of things came together just now. This is great. So don't lose hope by the time you get to that early 20s time. But things like a parent telling a child it's time to do something. A good transition is writing a couple of things on a schedule. And then you move from saying time to do the thing to it's time to check your schedule, right? And then to setting an alarm. And when the alarm goes off, you say, I just heard the alarm, it's time to check your schedule. And then eventually the alarm goes off and we're having the child check the schedule when the alarm goes off instead of just when you're saying the alarm went off. So you can do sort of stepwise progressions towards creating systems for that help take care of those things that you are the reminder system for, right? You might be a lot more flexible than the timer on the refrigerator. So that may be part of why you're preferred instead of the timer on the refrigerator, right? The sensory aspects of those different kinds of supports are also really important to think about and to consider as well. And the reassurance that sometimes is needed about, I think I'm following the plan right, but I'm not totally sure. Having somebody around that kind of can be the support for that is really important. We've done things like for young adults with autism or autistic young adults, depending on the preference for language, there is taking a picture of a finished clean room, and so that they can look at the picture and see if it matches the room that they think they cleaned, right? So thinking creatively about when you are asked to do those things, what are you scanning for? What are you doing? And how can I create a system for that? And then in a patient and joining kind of way, help create a stepwise progression towards independence. Leveraging peers in that process can also be really helpful too.
That felt helpful for me too. As yes. So there's another question that came in and it said, basically, what do you think about hiring a coach, like an executive functioning coach? This parent's son is struggling, especially with procrastination and planning. It looks like he's in high school, so teenager, so middle school, high school. And then do you have any referrals of executive functioning coaches?
Oh, that's a great question. I think coaches can be fantastic for people that can swing it. I've certainly wished I've had a coach at various times. So I think that can be wonderful. There are a lot of strategies that coaches help with and that people help with that can be replicated without necessarily having to have a coach. So one of the things that we know is true for people with ADHD is that when somebody else knows what it is that you're working on, even if their job isn't to check in on you, they just know and they're in the same space, that actually activates the neurochemicals in the brain that keep executive functioning fired up. And so just the presence of another person whose brain knows what your brain is working on can be enough to support a lot of executive function challenges. So there's actually a website now where people can use Zoom to log in, report to other people what it is that they're working on, and then just work. And the brain space is shared, the shared goal is shared. Nobody's saying, are you still working? Are you playing Angry Birds? It's just knowing that another brain is holding this somehow helps my brain hold it in the same place as well. So I feel like I've heard some good things about Hallowell Todaro for coaching, but it's been a while, so I'm not totally sure. Oh, and Anna, did you find that website? Try to yeah, I can't remember what it's called. Cave something or other.
It looks like she has on here. Oh,
the one I know. But
Focus Mate. Okay, there's something else that's like cave something, or I can't remember what it is. So
yeah, you just schedule yourself a time that you need to work on a thing, and they schedule someone else to work on a thing, and you tell each other what you're working on, and then you just mute and work. But it's quite magical. I may have used it.
Awesome. That sounds
Allison,
great.
Allison, can you? Oh, okay. So you wrote in there Hello Well.
Tadaro is a
Perfect. Awesome.
PhD diagnostic system. Yeah.
Okay. So Jessica wants to know, are there any examples on how to frame those accommodations for executive functioning in an IEP? So
yeah, I think there's lots, and that Understood website that I mentioned has a lot of good ideas for language to use for putting accommodations in for executive functioning and organization into the IEP. I think one of the things that I would also just caution people for, or maybe remind you of, is sometimes an accommodation isn't enough. Sometimes there has to be SDI, or specially designed instruction, to teach somebody to use the accommodation, or to teach the skill of self-advocating for accessing that accommodation, right? I've heard teachers say, well, they have this accommodation, but they never ask for it. Well, there's a missing skill piece there, right? Or maybe it's a safety piece, but yeah.
great. Okay. Well, I want to be cognizant of time. It is 8:34, and I so appreciate your being here and going through this presentation. Yeah, we really are thankful that you were here. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And thanks to all of you for what you're doing, showing up here and showing up for kids too. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.